January 17, 1945. The Comer pocket. Alsace-Lorraine. The snow fell in silence. Not the gentle silence of Christmas cards or childhood memories, but the heavy, suffocating silence that comes when winter and war conspire to drain all sound from the world. Along the frozen banks of the Ill River, the pine forest stood black against white, their branches weighted down with ice that cracked like distant rifle shots. When the wind came through, the temperature had dropped to 14 degrees Fahrenheit. Men's breath crystallized before their faces, metal burned skin at the slightest touch. In a shallow fighting position scraped from frozen earth and reinforced with logs stripped from a destroyed farmhouse, Private First Class Eugene Stoner, a welder's son from Indiana, with grease permanently embedded beneath his fingernails, cradled something that looked like it had been assembled in a garage by a man who'd had too much coffee and a little supervision. The weapon was a monstrosity of salvaged parts, the barrel of a destroyed M19-8 Thompson submachine gun. The receiver hand machine from a block of steel. Stoner had traded 3 cartons of Lucky Strikes for a trigger assembly cannibalized from 2 different firearms, and a magazine well that accepted Thompson drums, but only if you inserted them at precisely the right angle while whispering what the other men swore were prayers to St. John Browning himself. The stock was carved from the door of a French armoire. The sling was fashioned from Wehrmacht leather belts. When Stoner moved, the weapon rattled with the sound of loose tolerances and improvised engineering. When he'd first brought it to the line 3 weeks earlier, the men of 2nd Squad, Baker Company, 254th Infantry Regiment had laughed. Corporal Williams had laughed so hard he'd fallen backwards off an ammunition crate. Sergeant McCutcheon had simply shaken his head and said, "Stoner, that thing looks like something a blind man built in the dark. And when you pull that trigger, if you're stupid enough to pull that trigger, it's going to blow your damn full head off." But Private Stoner had not pulled the trigger then. He had smiled his quiet smile, the one that never quite reached his eyes, and he had returned to his position. He had continued to work on his creation with files stolen from the battalion maintenance, shed and oil he'd rendered from pork fat. He had test-fired it once, behind the lines, into a snowbank, and the weapon had roared like something ancient and wounded. It had not exploded. It had not jammed. It had fired all 50 rounds from its drum magazine in approximately 7 seconds. And when the echo faded, Stoner had nodded once to himself and reloaded. Now, in the gray light before dawn, the laughter had stopped. Across 100 yards of frozen farmland, through the skeletal remains of what had once been an apple orchard, the Germans were coming. They moved in the pre-dawn darkness with the confidence of men who had been trained since adolescence to believe in their own superiority, in the mathematical certainty of German tactical doctrine, in the inevitability of their victory. These were not the teenagers and old men of the Volkssturm, not the hollow-eyed remnants of shattered divisions retreating across the Rhine. These were Waffen-SS, 2nd Mountain Division, veterans of the Eastern Front who had learned warfare in the frozen hell of the Demian's pocket and perfected it in the savage house-to-house fighting of Kharkov. They wore winter camouflage that rendered them nearly invisible against the snow. They carried Sturmgewehr 40 for assault rifles, weapons years ahead of anything the Americans had in mass production. They advanced by the book, fire teams alternating, movement and covering fire, perfect spacing, textbook execution. They had been told by their officers that the Americans across the river were soft, shopkeepers and farm boys playing as soldier, men whose nation had known nothing but prosperity and peace until 1941, who had grown fat on plenty while Germany had been forged hard in the fires of perpetual struggle. The propaganda had shown them photographs of American prisoners, well-fed faces, clean uniforms, expressions of bewilderment rather than fanaticism. The Americans had better equipment. Yes, everyone knew this, but equipment meant nothing without the will to use it. Without the ideological steel that turned men into weapons, the Americans, they had been assured, would break. They always broke. At Kasserine Pass they had broken. At the Rapido River they had broken. They would break here because Americans did not understand what it meant to truly fight, to truly suffer, to sacrifice everything for something greater than their own individual comfort. What the SS men advancing through the orchard did not know what they could not have known was that Private Eugene Stoner had been working in his father's machine shop since he was 9 years old. He had been building things since before he understood the mathematics that governed why they worked. He had been called up in the draft of 1943, and he had gone without complaint. But he had taken with him a mechanical mind that saw the world as a series of problems requiring engineering solutions. When the Thompson he'd been issued had been destroyed by shrapnel from an 88mm shell that had killed 2 men and left Stoner himself temporarily deaf in his left ear, he had not requisitioned a replacement. He had not filed the proper forms or gone through proper channels. He had simply begun to build. The Army, in its vast bureaucratic wisdom, had taught Eugene Stoner to kill, but Eugene Stoner's father, in the small wisdom of American self-reliance and individual ingenuity, had taught him to create. And what Eugene Stoner had created, there in the frozen mud of Alsace, was about to speak. The lead German was 40 yards away when Sergeant McCutcheon hissed, "Stoner now." The homemade Thompson came up to Private Stoner's shoulder with a motion that was smooth despite the weapon's ungainly appearance. His finger found the trigger, a trigger he had personally filed, and polished until its pull weight was exactly 4 pounds, no more, no less. His eye found the crude Nacham post sights he had soldered to the barrel, and in the 1.5 seconds between McCutcheon's command and what came next, Eugene Stoner was not thinking about ideology or national destiny or any of the grand narratives that nations tell themselves to justify sending their sons to die in foreign snow. He was thinking about trigger control and sight picture, and the timing required to compensate for a bolt that ran slightly slower than standard specifications. He pressed the trigger. The weapon did not fire. It exploded into a sustained roar that was louder than any standard Thompson, a thunderous hammering that seemed to originate not from the gun, but from the earth itself. The crude compensator Stoner had welded to the muzzle a device of his own design, untested by any ordnance department, unapproved by any regulation, channeled the muzzle blast in a way that kept the weapon flat despite its light weight and improvised construction. 50 rounds left the barrel in just under 5 seconds. 45 of them found targets. The SS squad leader was hit 3 times before he understood he was being fired upon. The man to his left took a burst across the chest that punched through winter camouflage, through wool, through skin and sternum, and exited in a spray of red mist that hung in the frozen air like obscene fog. The fire team on the right flank attempted to dive for cover and died horizontal, bodies tumbling into the snow with the boneless finality of puppets with cut strings. A man with an MG-42 machine gun managed to traverse his weapon toward the source of the firing, before 4 rounds caught him in a diagonal line from hip to shoulder, and he collapsed forward onto his gun, which continued to point uselessly at empty sky. The drum magazine went empty. Stoner's hands that had changed tires and rebuilt carburetors, and helped his father lay steel on a machine, older than he was, moved with practiced efficiency, out with the empty drum, reach for the spare, insert at the proper angle, feel for the click, confirm the seating, chamber around. Time elapsed. 3 seconds. The second drum held 75 rounds. An oversized model Stoner had modified personally, though everyone said it wouldn't work, said the spring tension would be wrong, said it would jam on the 3rd round and leave him holding a useless metal club. It did not jam. The second burst caught the survivors as they attempted to withdraw, cut them down in mid-retreat, sent them sprawling into snow that was no longer white. In the space of perhaps 8 seconds of actual trigger time, spread across the magazine changes and a total time elapse of less than 1 minute, Private Eugene Stoner had killed or mortally wounded every member of a 12-man SS assault squad. The homemade Thompson, the weapon they had mocked, the garage-built monstrosity that violated every regulation in the Army's technical manuals, had functioned flawlessly. Not a single stoppage, not a single failure to feed or failure to extract. Just mechanical perfection achieved through intuition and skill and the peculiarly American belief that if something needs doing, you find a way to do it yourself. Silence returned to the orchard, the kind of silence that comes after violence when even the wind seems reluctant to move. Sergeant McCutcheon, who had fought across North Africa and Sicily and Normandy, who had seen men die in every way that men can die, slowly lowered his binoculars. He looked at Stoner. He looked at the weapon. He looked back at the orchard, where the snow was no longer unbroken and white. "Jesus Christ, Stoner," he said quietly. "Jesus Christ." The other men said nothing. Corporal Williams, who had laughed, was not laughing now. He was staring at the homemade Thompson with an expression that mixed awe and something like fear. The fear that comes when you realize that the rules you thought governed reality are more flexible than you believed, Private Stoner ejected the partial magazine, cleared the chamber, and began to field strip the weapon for cleaning. His hands were steady. His breathing was normal. He had killed 12 men in less time than it took to smoke a cigarette, and he showed no more emotion than he had shown when rebuilding his father's drill press at age 14. This is not a story about one man in one orchard on one frozen morning in January 1945. This is a story about two different philosophies of warfare, two different understandings of what it means to be a soldier, and two different nations' relationships with violence and technology and the individual human being. For Germany, warfare had become a form of higher mathematics. The Wehrmacht and the SS had developed tactical doctrines that were studied in staff colleges, had refined infantry tactics to a science, had created a military machine of extraordinary efficiency and terrifying competence. German soldiers were trained to operate as cogs in this machine, each man performing his function in perfect synchronization with his comrades, all individuality subordinated to the greater purpose of the unit. The German army did not encourage improvisation. It did not celebrate individual ingenuity. It created specialists, men who were extraordinarily good at doing exactly what they had been trained to do in exactly the way they had been trained to do it. And when Private Eugene Stoner built a weapon in a frontline foxhole using salvaged parts and hand tools, when he violated every regulation and ignored every proper procedure, when he succeeded through individual initiative in creating something that worked better than it had any right to work, he was embodying something that German military doctrine could not account for and did not understand. The American military in 1945 was not superior to its German counterpart in training, in tactical doctrine, or in battlefield experience. American troops in their first engagements were routinely outfought by German units. American tank crews died in Shermans that were mechanically reliable, but undergunned and underarmored compared to German panzers. American infantry tactics were often crude compared to the refined brutality of Wehrmacht assault techniques. But the American military possessed one advantage that did not appear on any table of organization, that could not be quantified in any after-action report. Its soldiers were citizens of a nation that had spent a century and a half telling them that individual ingenuity mattered, that the lone inventor in his workshop could change the world, that the proper response to being told something was impossible was to figure out how to do it anyway. Eugene Stoner's homemade Thompson was not an anomaly. It was an expression of a culture. In thousands of workshops and garages across America, men had grown up learning to fix things, to build things, to improvise solutions to mechanical problems, because the nearest specialist was 50 miles away and you needed a tractor working by morning. The American industrial economy had created a nation of amateur engineers, men who might not know the mathematics but understood intuitively how machines worked, what metal could do, how to look at a problem and see a solution that wasn't in any manual. The Germans had better tanks, but when American tank crews found their 75mm guns couldn't penetrate German armor, they didn't wait for new tanks to be shipped from Detroit. They welded additional armor plates scavenged from destroyed vehicles. They modified their tactics. They figured out that if you couldn't punch through the front armor, you maneuvered until you could hit the sides. When the Bocage hedgerows of Normandy stopped the American advance, a sergeant whose name has been lost to history welded salvaged steel rails to the front of a Sherman tank to create a hedge-cutting blade, and within weeks, similar devices were being fabricated in field workshops across the front. When supply lines couldn't keep up with the rapid advance across France, American mechanics kept vehicles running with parts cannibalized from wrecks, with improvised repairs that would have horrified factory engineers, but which worked well enough to matter. The German military machine was magnificent, but it was brittle. It worked perfectly as long as conditions matched expectations, as long as the enemy fought the way doctrine said he would fight, as long as the carefully planned logistics functioned as designed. When conditions changed, when the unexpected occurred, the machine did not adapt well. It required new orders, new plans, new training. Individual German soldiers, no matter how brave or skilled, had been taught to wait for direction from above. Individual American soldiers, for better or worse, had been taught something different. They had been taught not through military training, but through cultural immersion, through growing up in a nation that celebrated inventors and tinkerers and self-made men, that when the system failed, when the proper equipment wasn't available, when the situation didn't match what the manual said, you improvised, you adapted, You made it work. This was not always an advantage. American individualism led to breakdowns in discipline, to units that didn't coordinate well, to soldiers who questioned orders and sometimes refused to follow them. American forces suffered from disorganization that would have been unthinkable in a German unit. But American individualism also meant that when a welder's son from Indiana found himself without a functioning weapon, he didn't simply accept being unarmed. He built a new weapon, and when that weapon was mocked by his comrades, he didn't abandon it. He perfected it. And when the moment came, when 12 highly trained SS soldiers were advancing through an orchard with the confidence of men who believed in their own superiority, Eugene Stoner and his homemade Thompson demonstrated that individual ingenuity, American ingenuity, could kill just as effectively as any doctrine. The SS troop who died in that orchard had been products of one of the most sophisticated military training systems ever devised. They had been selected for physical perfection and ideological purity. They had been taught that they were members of a master race, warriors in an army fighting for civilization itself against the degeneracy of the mongrel democracies. They had been given the best weapons German industry could produce, and they had been killed by a farm boy with a homemade gun he built in a foxhole. The symbolism was not lost on the survivors, those few Germans who had been in supporting positions and witnessed the massacre without being caught in it. When they reported back to their commanders, when they described how an American position had produced such devastating fire from what appeared to be a single weapon, their officers did not believe them. The mathematics didn't work. A single Thompson, even in skilled hands, could not achieve that rate of accurate fire, could not service that many targets that quickly. The survivors must have been mistaken. There must have been multiple weapons. A machine gun nest that had gone undetected. The alternative, that one American with one modified weapon had wiped out an entire assault squad, did not fit the narrative, did not match the careful calculations about American weakness and German superiority. Asterisk, but the bodies in the orchard testified to a different truth. They lay in the snow in the precise patterns that ballistics would dictate for fire. From a single point source, they had been killed by point for 5 caliber rounds, Thompson rounds, all fired within a span of seconds. And when German intelligence officers eventually pieced together what had happened, when they understood that the American weapon had been hand-built from salvaged parts by a soldier who had no formal training in weapons design, it shook something fundamental in their understanding of the war, because the German military system could never have produced Eugene Stoner. A German soldier who attempted to build his own weapon would have been court-martialed. A German private who ignored regulations and improvised his own solutions would have been disciplined, probably harshly. The entire structure of German military culture was built on obedience, on following orders, on trusting that the system would provide what you needed and that your role was simply to use what you were given in the way you had been trained to use it. Individual initiative was not encouraged. It was suppressed. The German army wanted soldiers who were interchangeable parts in a well-oiled machine, not individuals who might decide that their own judgment was better than their orders. The American military, by contrast, had an entire category in its regulations called field expedient solutions. American doctrine explicitly acknowledged that soldiers in combat would encounter situations not covered by any manual, and it gave them permission, indeed, expected them to improvise. This did not mean there were no rules, no discipline, no structure, but it meant that when the rules didn't cover the situation, American soldiers were authorized to figure something out. And more than that, American culture had prepared them to figure something out. It had given them childhood spent taking apart radios and rebuilding engines and solving mechanical problems through experimentation. It had given them a national pathology full of inventors and pioneers and self-reliant individuals who succeeded by ignoring what the experts said was impossible. Eugene Stoner's homemade Thompson became a legend within the 254th Infantry Regiment. Men who had mocked it now wanted to see it, to touch it, to understand how it worked. Stoner, characteristically, did not seem to understand what the fuss was about. He had had a problem, no weapon. He had applied a solution, built a weapon. The weapon had worked. This seemed, to his mind, like a perfectly logical sequence of events. When other men asked if he could build weapons for them, he shook his head. Each weapon, he explained, had to be fitted to the specific parts available. You couldn't mass-produce field expedient solutions. That wasn't how improvisation worked. But he did begin to advise other soldiers on modifications to their standard weapons, a file here to smooth a rough feed ramp, a slight adjustment to a trigger spring there. Small changes that made weapons more reliable, more accurate, more suited to the individual soldier's needs. He became, without any official designation, the company's unofficial armorer, the man you went to when your weapon wasn't working right, and you didn't want to go through official channels. That might take weeks to resolve the problem. The irony was lost on no one. The Army had trained Eugene Stoner to be an infantryman, but Eugene Stoner's real gift was engineering. After the war, after the orchard and the river and the long push into Germany itself, after the surrender and the occupation and the slow voyage home, Eugene Stoner would return to civilian life. He would work as a machinist. He would tinker in workshops, and eventually, a decade after that frozen morning in Alsace, he would design a rifle that would revolutionize military firearms, a lightweight, modular weapon built around principles of simplicity and reliability, a weapon that could be field stripped and maintained by any soldier with basic training, a weapon that embodied the same philosophy as that homemade Thompson in the orchard. That individual soldiers needed tools they could understand, modify, and trust. That rifle would be designated the AR-15. The military would adopt it as the M16. It would arm American forces for the next 70 years. And it would exist because a welder's son from Indiana had once built a submachine gun in a foxhole and discovered that he had a gift for creating weapons that worked. But in January 1945, none of this had happened yet. In January 1945, Eugene Stoner was just a private first class with grease under his fingernails and a homemade weapon. That rattled when he moved. The snow continued to fall. The war continued its terrible mathematics of attrition and advance. And in an orchard near the Ill River, 12 bodies gradually disappeared beneath fresh snow, buried by a winter that did not care about ideology or national destiny or competing philosophies of warfare. The German command rotated new troops into the line to replace the SS squad that had been annihilated. These new troops were informed that they were facing Americans, and they should not underestimate them, but neither should they fear them. The Americans had material superiority, yes, but material could be overcome by superior will, by superior training, by the inherent superiority of men who had been forged hard by years of total war. The new troops nodded and cleaned their weapons and prepared for their own assaults. They believed what they had been told. They had no reason not to believe it. Across the frozen farmland, Private Stoner cleaned his homemade Thompson for the 5th time that day. He had fired approximately 125 rounds through it, and while the weapon had performed flawlessly, he was concerned about the wear patterns he was seeing on the bolt. The steel he had used was good, but it wasn't arsenal grade. It would wear faster than standard specifications called for. He would need to fabricate a replacement bolt soon, perhaps in the next week or two, before the current bolt wore to the point where timing became inconsistent. This was not a concern a normal infantryman would have. Normal infantrymen did not think about bolt timing, but Eugene Stoner was not a normal infantryman. He was an engineer who happened to be wearing an army uniform, and he approached his homemade weapon the way his father had taught him to approach any machine, with constant attention, with preventive maintenance, with the understanding that reliability was not something that happened by accident, but something you built into the system. Through care and forethought, Sergeant McCutcheon watched Stoner work and said nothing. There was nothing to say. McCutcheon had been in the Army for 11 years. He had seen weapons of every description. He had seen expert marksmen and natural soldiers and men who seemed to have been born knowing how to fight. But he had never seen anything quite like Eugene Stoner, had never encountered a soldier who treated warfare as an engineering problem, to be solved through careful analysis and creative problem solving. It should not have worked. By every regulation and doctrine McCutcheon had ever learned, it should not have worked, but the bodies in the orchard proved that it had worked. That sometimes individual genius mattered more than doctrine, that the American faith in the individual's ability to innovate and adapt was not just propaganda, but a genuine advantage that could be measured in dead enemy soldiers and living American ones. The philosophical implications of this were too large for Sergeant McCutcheon to fully process. He was not a philosopher. He was a career NCO whose job was to keep his men alive and complete his missions. But he understood, in some fundamental way that required no words, that what he had witnessed was important. That it said something significant about the difference between an army of conscripts who believed in individual liberty and an army of fanatics who believed in collective destiny. He could not have articulated this understanding, could not have written it down or explained it in any coherent way, but he felt it. The way you feel truths that are fundamental to require explanation. The cold deepened as night came on. Temperatures dropped to single digits. Men huddled in their fighting positions and tried to stay warm and failed. This was the winter of 1944-45, one of the coldest winters Europe had experienced in decades. And men were dying of exposure even when no bullets flew. The Germans were dying of it. The Americans were dying of it. The cold did not care about ideology or training or national character. It killed Democrats and fascists with equal efficiency. But even here, even in the brutal arithmetic of winter warfare, American material abundance manifested itself in ways that mattered. American soldiers had better winter clothing than their German counterparts. Not because American uniforms were better designed. German winter gear was actually superior in many ways, but because American industry could produce enough of it. Every American soldier on the front had a winter coat. Most had gloves, scarves, insulated boots. The supply system, for all its failures and inefficiencies, generally managed to get cold weather gear forward. By contrast, German soldiers were increasingly issued whatever could be found: summer weight uniforms in January, boots that fell apart after a week of mud, inadequate rations that left men without the calories needed to maintain body heat. The German army was still tactically superior in many ways, but it was slowly being strangled by mathematics, by the simple reality that American factories could outproduce German factories. American farms could feed an army while German farms went untended. American logistics could maintain a transatlantic supply line while German logistics struggled to move supplies 50 miles. Eugene Stoner's homemade Thompson was built from American abundance, the salvaged barrel from a weapon that had been destroyed and discarded rather than repaired because new weapons were plentiful enough. That field repair wasn't necessary. The steel block traded for cigarettes that American soldiers received free in their rations, while German soldiers went without tobacco for weeks. The tools stolen from a maintenance shed that was well stocked because American supply doctrine called for redundancy and over-provisioning rather than careful rationing of scarce resources. Even Stoner's improvised weapon was, in its way, evidence of American material superiority. He could build it because the raw materials of war were abundant enough. That salvage and theft were possible because the American supply system was generous, enough that he could trade luxury goods for necessities, because American soldiers had enough spare time and energy that one of them could spend weeks machining parts in his fighting position. A German soldier in equivalent circumstances would not have had the materials, the tools, or the energy to attempt such a project. He would have been too hungry, too cold, too desperately engaged in simple survival to contemplate building a weapon from scratch. And even if he had somehow acquired the materials and found the time, his officers would have stopped him, would have viewed such individual initiative as a threat to unit discipline rather than a potential advantage. This was the great unspoken truth of the war in Europe by early 1945. The outcome was no longer in doubt. Germany was losing, not because German soldiers were inferior, they were not, and not because German tactics were flawed, they were not, but because Germany was being buried under the weight of American and Soviet industrial production, because the arithmetic of total war favored nations that could absorb terrible casualties and continue fighting, because ideological fanaticism and tactical brilliance could not overcome the simple mathematics of resources. Germany had started a war against nations that could outproduce it 10-1, and no amount of courage or skill or superior training could change that fundamental equation. But the individual German soldiers advancing through the Colmar Pocket in January 1945 did not think in these terms. They thought about their missions, their orders, their immediate tactical situations. They believed, because they had to believe, that their training and dedication would be enough, that superior could triumph over superior material, that the next attack would break the American line and everything would change. The next attack came 3 days after the Orchard Massacre. Different unit, different approach, but the same underlying confidence. These Germans had not been told about the SS squad that had disappeared. Command had decided that such information would damage morale without providing any tactical value. So the new assault troops advanced with the same assumptions their predecessors had held. The same belief in American weakness and German superiority. They discovered their error when Private Stoner opened fire at 60 yards and cut down the lead fire team before they could take cover. The homemade Thompson roared and men died, and the survivors retreated in disorder. A few hours later, a third probe, this time under cover of mortar fire, same result. Stoner's position had become what military planners call a hardpoint, a position that could not be taken by conventional assault. That would require either overwhelming force or bypass. The German commanders chose bypass. They shifted their attack axis 300 yards to the north, where the American line was held by soldiers with standard weapons and standard training. They achieved better results there. They pushed the Americans back to 100 yards before. A counterattack stabilized the line. Men died on both sides in numbers that would have been unthinkable in any previous war, numbers that had become routine in this war of industrial slaughter. But Private Stoner's position held. His sector did not budge, and word began to spread. Through the informal networks of soldiers who talked to other soldiers, that second squad, Baker Company had a man with a homemade gun who couldn't be killed and couldn't be defeated, a man who had single-handedly stopped multiple German assaults. This was not true, of course. Stoner had not stopped the assaults. Single-handedly his squad mates had fought alongside him, had provided covering fire and supporting fires and all the other functions that infantry combat requires. But myths simplify, and soldiers need myths, need heroes, need stories that make sense of senseless violence. So Eugene Stoner became, in the retelling, something more than he was, a superhuman figure, an American folk hero with a magical weapon, a symbol of everything that made America powerful. Stoner himself found this deeply uncomfortable. He was not a hero. He was a machinist who had built a tool and used it effectively. The fact that the tool was designed to kill people did not, in his mind, make its construction heroic any more than building an efficient lathe was heroic. It was simply engineering. You identified the requirements, you gathered the materials, you fabricated the parts, you assembled and tested the system. The morality of the system's purpose was not his concern. His concern was functionality. Did it work? Did it work reliably? Could it be maintained in field conditions? These were engineering questions, not moral ones. But the other man needed him to be a hero, needed his story to mean something beyond mechanical efficiency. So he let them tell their stories, and he said nothing to correct the exaggerations. And he continued to clean his weapon and file his parts and think about bolt timing, at feed ramp angles. The war ground forward. The Colmar pocket was reduced. The Americans pushed toward the Rhine. Eugene Stoner survived, though many around him did not. His homemade Thompson survived too, functioning flawlessly through battles whose names would be remembered, and battles whose names would be forgotten. Through the crossing of the Rhine and the push into Germany itself, through the last desperate resistance of an army that knew it was defeated but fought anyway because orders were orders, and retreat was treason. In late April 1945, less than 2 weeks before Germany's surrender, Stoner's unit liberated a small forced labor camp outside Munich. The prisoners were mostly French and Polish civilians who had been worked nearly to death in a munitions factory. They were skeletal, disease-ridden, barely alive. The American soldiers gave them rations and water and medical attention, but many were far gone. They died after liberation, died free, but died nonetheless, and the American soldiers who had seen so much death, who had been numbed by years of killing and witnessing killing, found themselves weeping at the sight of these civilians who had been murdered slowly by a system that viewed them as disposable resources. Eugene Stoner did not weep. He moved through the camp with his characteristic quietness, distributing his own rations, helping to carry the sick to the aid station the medics had established. And when the former prisoners learned that he had built his own weapon, when they asked to see the famous homemade gun they had heard about from other soldiers, he showed them, and they touched it with something like reverence. These people who had been enslaved by a nation that had believed in the supremacy of the collective over the individual, in the state's right to dispose of human beings as it saw fit. They touched the crude welding marks and the improvised stock and the hand-filed parts, and they understood what many American soldiers did not understand, that this weapon was not just a tool, not just an effective firearm, but a symbol of everything. Their captors had tried to destroy the idea that individual human beings possessed inherent worth, that individual creativity and ingenuity mattered, that authority was not absolute, that roles could be questioned, and systems could be improved by people working alone with their hands and their minds. One of the prisoners, a French schoolteacher who spoke some English, tried to explain this to Stoner. "This gun," he said, "it is more than gun. It is freedom made metal. You understand. Your people, you do not always understand what you have. You think freedom is politics, is voting, is speeches. But freedom is this, to see problem and make solution without permission, to build what you need because you need it, to think for yourself. The Germans, they could never make this gun, not because they lack skill, they have great skill, but because they have lost the habit of thinking for themselves, of trusting themselves. They wait for orders, for approval, for someone to tell them what is permitted. You did not wait. You built. This is why you win, not because you have more guns, though you do, but because your guns come from men who think." Eugene Stoner did not know what to say to this. He nodded uncomfortably and moved on to other tasks. But the Frenchman's words stayed with him, lodged in his memory alongside equations and tolerances and all the technical knowledge he carried. And later, much later, when he was designing the rifle that would bear his name, he would think about that conversation in the camp. He would remember the idea that freedom was not just an abstract political concept, but something concrete, something that manifested in the ability of individuals to create and innovate without waiting for permission. And he would design his rifle to embody that idea of a weapon that was modular and simple, that could be understood and modified by individual soldiers, that trusted the end user to maintain and adapt it rather than requiring expert technicians and centralized authority. The AR-15, the M16, the rifle that would arm America's military for 3 generations, it would be Eugene Stoner's. Homemade Thompson writ large, the same philosophy scaled up and refined, the same belief that individual soldiers were not interchangeable cogs but thinking human beings who deserved tools they could understand and trust. But that was still years away. In April 1945, Eugene Stoner was just a 22-year-old private with a homemade gun and too many memories. Germany surrendered. The shooting stopped. Men who had spent years trying to kill each other stood in silence and tried to remember how to be human beings rather than weapons. Some succeeded. Many did not. Eugene Stoner went home to Indiana, to a nation that had not been bombed or invaded or starved, to factories that were converting back to civilian production, to a future that seemed limitless because America had emerged from the war not just victorious, but stronger, richer, more powerful than it had been before. The homemade Thompson came home with him. He kept it for years, though it was technically illegal for him to possess an automatic weapon without proper licenses. He kept it in his workshop, mounted on a wall, and sometimes when he was working on other projects, he would look at it and remember the orchard and the snow and the bodies falling. He did not think of himself as a killer. He did not suffer from nightmares or guilt or any of the psychological wounds that afflicted so many veterans. He had done what needed doing, had solved the problem in front of him with the tools and knowledge available that the solution involved. Killing did not change its fundamental nature as an engineering problem. This made him, in some ways, the perfect soldier, completely functional, undamaged by violence, able to kill without remorse, and it made him, in other ways, something slightly inhuman, a man whose emotional distance from his own actions allowed him to function in situations that would break ordinary people. Which version was the truth? Perhaps both, perhaps neither. Eugene Stoner was not interested in psychology or self-analysis. He was interested in making things that worked. The homemade Thompson had worked. That was all that mattered. The men who had laughed at his weapon never laughed again. Not about that. Some of them visited him after the war, looked up his address, and made the trip to Indiana to see him, to thank him, to tell him that he had saved their lives in the orchard and a dozen other fights. He was polite, but distant with these visitors. He did not understand what they wanted from him. He had built a gun. He had used it effectively. These were statements of fact, not subjects for emotional reflection. But he let them talk, and he served them coffee his wife made, and he showed them his workshop, where he was building other things, now a milling machine, a custom rifle for target shooting, a small lathe of his own design, and the visitors would leave feeling vaguely unsatisfied, because they wanted the man they had mythologized to acknowledge his own heroism, to recognize that he had been important, that he had mattered. But Eugene Stoner never gave them that satisfaction. He had solved a problem. That was all. In the last years of his life, long after the M16 had made him famous in certain circles, long after he had become Eugene Stoner, the firearms designer, rather than Eugene Stoner, the private first class, interviewers would sometimes ask him about the homemade Thompson. Was it true? Had he really built a submachine gun in a foxhole? Had he really killed 12 SS soldiers in 45 seconds? He would confirm the basic facts and correct the exaggerations. It hadn't been 45 seconds, it had been closer. To a minute including magazine changes, it hadn't been a foxhole. It had been a reinforced fighting position. The weapon hadn't been built in the field. He had machined most of the critical parts behind the lines using borrowed tools. Details mattered. Precision mattered. Myths were emotionally satisfying, but engineering required accuracy. And when they asked him what it meant, what larger lesson should be drawn from his story, he would shake his head. It didn't mean anything beyond what it was. A soldier who needed a weapon had built one. If there was symbolism in that, if it said something about American culture or individual freedom, or the difference between democracy and fascism, that was for other people to determine. He was not a philosopher or a historian. He was an engineer. He built things. Some of those things were weapons. That was all. But of course it was not all. It was never all. The homemade Thompson that Eugene Stoner built in the winter of 1945 was a weapon, yes, but it was also a statement. Whether Stoner intended it as such or not, it was a statement that authority was not absolute, that regulations were not sacred, that individual judgment could trump institutional wisdom. It was a statement that problems could be solved by lone individuals working with their hands and minds, without committees or approval or proper channels. It was a statement that the individual mattered, that one man with skill and determination could make a difference, could change outcomes, could kill a dozen enemies or save a dozen friends, or design a rifle that would arm a nation. This was the American promise, the idea that had drawn immigrants across oceans and sent pioneers across continents. That individual effort mattered, that the system existed to serve individuals rather than individuals existing to serve the system. That authority had to earn legitimacy rather than demanding obedience. And in the frozen orchard near the Ill River, when Eugene Stoner opened fire with a weapon that should not have existed, that violated every regulation and broke every rule. That worked because one man believed it would work and made it work. Through skill and stubbornness in that moment, the American promise was made manifest in steel and gunpowder and the bodies of enemy soldiers. Falling into snow, the Germans who died there had believed in a different promise. That collective effort would triumph, that obedience to authority was the highest virtue, that individual desires and judgments must be subordinated to the greater good of the state. They had been trained to believe this, had been educated in schools that taught this, had been raised in a society that enforced this through propaganda and violence. And they had been wrong, not because their belief was morally inferior though it was, but because it was functionally inferior. Because systems that suppress individual initiative in favor of collective conformity are brittle, are fragile, are vulnerable to the unexpected in ways that systems permitting individual innovation are not. Eugene Stoner should not have been able to build that weapon. The regulations said he could not. The technical manuals said it was impossible. The limitations of field conditions said it could not be done. But Eugene Stoner did not care what the regulations said or what the manuals claimed or what the limitations were supposed to be. He had a problem and he solved it. And in solving it, he demonstrated something that no propaganda poster or patriotic speech could have demonstrated as clearly, that freedom was not just an abstract, political concept, but a practical advantage. That nations which trusted their citizens to think and create and improvise had advantages over nations that demanded obedience and conformity. That democracy messy, inefficient. Undisciplined democracy could produce outcomes that authoritarianism, for all its surface efficiency, could never match. This was why America won the war. Not because American soldiers were better, they were not. Not because American tactics were superior, they were not. But because America was a nation of Eugene Stoners, men and women who had been taught from childhood that problems were meant to be solved, that authority was meant to be questioned, that the proper response to being told something was impossible was to figure out how to do it anyway. This cultural inheritance, this habit of mind, this peculiarly American combination of optimism and stubbornness, A practical ingenuity, this was the secret weapon that no German intelligence officer could have quantified. No tactical doctrine could have countered. In the end, the homemade Thompson was not important because it killed a dozen men in an orchard. Men died by the thousands every day in that war. 12 more or less made no statistical difference. The homemade Thompson was important because it was a perfect symbol, a crystallization of the conflict between two worldviews, two philosophies, to understandings of what human beings were and what they could become. It was a weapon built from freedom, wielded by freedom, in defense of freedom, and when it spoke, in that orchard, in that frozen winter dawn, it spoke truths that no sermon or speech could have conveyed as clearly, that individuals matter, that creativity cannot be regimented, that the human spirit, inventive, stubborn, unreasonably optimistic, cannot be conquered by any ideology that seeks to reduce human beings. Two cogs in a machine. Eugene Stoner built a gun. That gun worked. Men died. These are facts. But facts, isolated, tell us nothing, only when we understand what those facts represent, what they symbolize, what larger truths they illuminate. Only then does history become more than a catalog of dates and events. Only then does the past speak to the present with a voice that matters. In a frozen orchard near a river whose name most Americans could not pronounce, in January of 1945, a welder's son from Indiana proved that freedom was not just an idea, but a force as real and tangible as steel, as deadly as gunpowder, as enduring as the human capacity to create and adapt and refuse to accept defeat. That is the story. That is what matters. That is what endures.